Everyone, welcome to the Wirewheel webinar on the top 3 reasons IT leaders need to make privacy a priority. My name is Judy Gordon, and I will be your host today. And I want to now pass it off to our moderator, Susan Markell.
Hi, everyone.
Off to you, Susan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Judy, for kicking us off. I want to welcome my panelists today. I have with me Chris Gettner, who is our co-founder and chief solutions architect at Wirewheel. Ed Peters, who is a senior director of architecture at Capital One. And Alfonso Cerdio, who is a cybersecurity and privacy director at PwC. Welcome. I'd like to start by having you each introduce yourselves a bit. If you could tell me a bit about yourself and include a little bit about your specific journey with privacy. Like, at what point did you start caring about privacy? At what point did it start to take a bigger role in your day-to-day? Chris, do you want to get us started? We'll go Chris, Ed, Alfonso this time around, and then we'll switch it up for the next set of questions.
Great, and thanks, Susan. Yeah, so I'm Chris Gettner. As Susan mentioned, I'm one of the founders of Wirewheel, and I'm both I started my career in aerospace and then got into entrepreneurial space recently. And one of the things that attracted me to the privacy space was I had, one of my prior ventures had been in legal technology, and seeing how technology was essentially transforming what was largely an administrative industry into something that was much more technological, much more data-driven. And I see the very same patterns going on with privacy and security.
Great. Ed.
I'm Ed Peters. I'm currently a senior architect at Capital One. My experience has been across a number of different industries, always in the technology spaces: software engineer, software architect, CTO. I've worked for companies that do business-to-business integration software, business process modeling and management, digital marketing, and other subject areas. And my own personal experience with privacy really sort of came to a point when I was working for a digital marketing company that was operating in the utility space. So our customers were highly regulated, and they had their own concerns about privacy. But then we got acquired, and the company that acquired us had their own concerns about privacy. And so we wound up having to do a lot of due diligence, both on an ongoing basis for our customers, and then also in this one giant flash during the acquisition. And it really kind of opened my eyes to a lot of the issues around privacy from the point of view of a practitioner. Once you're dedicated to answering a certain set of questions or complying with a certain set of requirements, how do you actually do that and motivate a small, medium, large size organization to do that efficiently and effectively? And then after that, I went into the privacy space, where I worked for several years. And I got to learn a lot more about the challenges that businesses face and some of the technology and approaches that they use to solve them.
Great. Thank you, Ed. Alfonso?
Hi, everyone. My name is Alfonso Cerdio. I'm a director at PwC, and I've been with PwC for quite a long time, almost like 12 years. And as part of that journey, I've been sort of like helping the firm and helping our clients to stand up their privacy programs. So a few years back, we started with a lot of policies, procedures, a lot of like setting up the governance around their programs itself. And then later, for the past few years, we've been sort of like helping most of our clients in their way to digitize their programs and to start operationalizing all those policies and procedures that we have out there. So we think that technology can transform the way they operate. And it is not only for like reducing the load of activities or the load of workload for the privacy team. It's also to create efficiencies, to start building some AI and machine learning models that can help clients and can help customers at the very end to receive like more privacy and more secure products at the end. So that's in a nutshell what am I doing at PwC.
All right, thanks, Alfonso. So in technical roles, we often have to think a lot about processes and tools and compliance. So I thought I'd kick us off with a question kind of shaped that way. When you think about privacy, how do you take this idea of compliance, tools, and methodologies into consideration in your day-to-day? And Ed, why don't you start it off?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that I know from time is that privacy and security tend to be lumped together frequently, for good or for bad. And a lot of the way that we approach security can be applied to privacy, not necessarily the reuse of individual tools or technologies, but the methodology of defense in depth when it comes to security. So typically companies won't rely on just one defense mechanism. They'll have various technical and process controls in place to ensure that there are a variety of different security checkpoints and maximize their opportunity to spot issues before they come up. And likewise with privacy, I think the technology and the process that you put in place there can provide the same kind of maximized opportunity for spotting issues. So it starts with from the very beginning of project inception, you think about how do we raise privacy to a first-class concern? How do we get teams that are kicking off a project to think about the data that they're using, why they're using it, and what they're doing with it. And then you think about tools and technologies for doing things like regular vendor management and ensuring that your vendors are taking good care of the data that you're sharing with them. And there are some tools and regular techniques that people use. They may do a quarterly, biannual, annual vendor assessment, that sort of thing. And then you might even have automated scanning tools in place that are doing things like looking for data sets that contain personal information or look like they contain personal information to kind of spot things that might have fallen through some of those other cracks. None of those by itself is going to fix everything, but the combination of them puts you in a much better place to answer questions about privacy and to have the confidence that you've got the best opportunity to have your best privacy foot forward.
Great. Thank you, Ed. Chris? Or sorry, Alfonso? Sorry, Chris. Alfonso?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, Ed. It's really important. I think privacy by design is becoming like a trend and a concept in the market right now. And it goes hand in hand with security, right? At the end of the day, most of the privacy controls and safeguards rely on security controls and safeguards. There's a lot of interaction in there, and it doesn't have to be really scared, right? Like there's a lot of things that there are technical terms that our privacy groups now need to speak about, like for example, encryption or tokenization or de-identification and stuff like that. That at the end of the day, I mean, it's just part of the privacy. I mean, privacy and security are going to be just the same thing. And I think both things sort of like add value to each other. And the programs at the end of the day are going to be more robust and more complex to be cracked if we have practices around both things.
Chris?
The thing I just want to add, because I obviously agree wholeheartedly with all that, but I think we just are going back and one thing Ed mentioned, which was confidence and visibility. Oftentimes privacy is the kind of state of the art of privacy right now is thought of as a compliance exercise, like a drag on the organization. It's something that you have to do, and it's slowing you down. But in reality, because of the emerging privacy laws and regulations, having the right tools in place and the right processes in place can actually help accelerate innovation and development in your product lines. Because instead of being concerned about, can I do X, Y, or Z with a certain set of data to exploit that for a new opportunity, having the right confidence in your tool set and having the right confidence in your process gives you that ability to say, I have confidence that I can do this and use this data in that way.
Yeah, you guys are touching on a couple, I think, of really interesting points. I think Ed mentioned it and Alfonso underscored it, like this overlap between privacy and security. And then also just like the sense that so often we're like looking as IT professionals, we're looking to like check the box on compliance rather than really embracing it and moving it forward. I think that's a really interesting point, Chris, that you bring up. So thank you. Alfonso, you had used the magic words like privacy by design, which I know it's a big initiative now and kind of something that we talk a lot about. Wonder if you could kick off our conversation around that. And specifically, how do you think about integrating privacy as part of projects like at kickoff and then throughout the cycle of a project to make sure that you're complying but also innovating along the way?
Yeah, so this is something that arrives to stay in here, right? So we're not just have to do that assessment at the beginning of a new initiative or a new project. It's not a transformational practice and a business as usual activity, let's say, that we're recommending our clients to follow in different stages. Obviously, at the first couple of months, there's going to be a heavy lift to map and to document all the current processing activities and current like products and services that we have out there. But there's going to be some point where you're going to reach out BAU, where we want to try to have security and privacy embedded into every like software life cycle development, right? Like SDLC, that we're basically following privacy and privacy controls as part of what we're creating, like either new software, new products, a relationship with a new third vendor, third party that is supporting the processing of data. At the end of the day, it's going to be embedded into everything. So it's really, really important to start thinking that privacy by design is a new concept that will stay with us for a long time. It's a new practice in place.
I would agree with that. Chris, thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it's more when I first learned about privacy by design, I thought about like design of product, but it's also the design of like the overall processes of everything, even to the point of sales opportunities. A lot of times, privacy and compliance, like in the old days of security, I draw an analogy that privacy is kind of where security was in the early 2000s, right? And so it used to be security was the thing you did at the end of deploying whatever you did, right? We all realize that's a mistake. And same thing with privacy, where privacy can get to the end, and then you get a blocker of like, wow, we didn't realize we shouldn't use this data, or we don't have the right consent for using it. And so forcing that up the chain wherever possible is, in general, is privacy by design, I think the best practices. And it goes just beyond the product. It could be the sales cycle, it could be budget approvals, it could be, kind of that entire spectrum.
Okay. Ed?
Yeah, so when I think about privacy by design, I think about a few things. One of them is the notion of repetition, that if you're thinking about something like, how do I inject privacy by design into my organization, you really want to look at what kind of design are you talking about? Are you talking about sort of the overall structure of your corporate business and information flows, which may change very slowly over time? Or are you looking at individual projects to stand up new applications or services? Are you looking at the inception of a new product line? The cadence at which those activities happen is going to have a big impact on your ability to inject privacy by design. If you do it once every 2 years, then it's going to be a different set of concerns and a different process. If it's an activity that you do on a regular cadence, like let's say your tech teams are working on a sprint-based methodology, and you're introducing new intent and development every 4 weeks or something like that, then you've got a better chance of creating a rhythm about it, and you want to think in terms of sort of privacy in the small. And so a lot depends on the scope you're thinking about. I think you're never wrong if you keep drilling towards the intent. What are you aiming to produce out of your privacy by design process? How do you get confidence that you've done the analysis you need? And really honestly, sometimes people hate checklists, but checklists are a great way to collaboratively brainstorm, what do we really think we need to know out of this process? And then they serve as a starting point rather than an ending point. The discussion isn't over when you finish the checklist. The discussion starts when you finish the checklist, and you can have a group of both the members of the project team and then also your control team talking about the various issues that come up.
And one thing I was just wondering, I think it's not only what you want to get out of it, but where do you want to focus first? I think it's an interesting challenge.
Yeah, and I think there are all kinds of interesting ways to do that prioritization. Going back to something that Alfonso said earlier about the overlap between privacy and security, typically in security, you think a little bit about threat modeling, and you think about who are the actors I'm the most worried about. Am I worried about external penetration of my network? Am I worried about bad actors internally? From a privacy perspective, you can do a little bit of that thinking as well. What are the privacy risks that I'm the most worried about? Is it simply a compliance activity? Are there particular use cases I have internally that I'm most worried about? A lot of times people will focus on things like their digital marketing, because that tends to be an area that gets a lot of attention. People don't like it when they get spam emails, and they might get really upset. Another area of big concern is machine learning. This is near and dear to my heart because it's what I do all day, every day now. But machine learning and digital decision making are a huge area of risk when it comes to privacy. And that's an area where you really have to spend time thinking deeply about what am I doing to ensure I'm making appropriate use of data.
And one thing that I would like to add, Ed, that I think is really, really important is you mentioned that probably the use of a checklist is a good tool to make sure that our teams are leveraging privacy across the whole process and across the whole life cycle. I think also that privacy by design sort of like encompasses multiple things. It's a policy, it's a procedure. We're going to have some tools and some checklists, and that kind of things should be closer to the teams, and it should be approachable to them. So at any point of their development or at any point of the unfold of that initiative, they can just go back and look at, well, what I'm doing in here is risky. What I'm doing in here should be raising out a flag, or how do I even sort of like raise that up to the privacy team, right? So some of those things, we just need to put all those things and mechanisms and techniques and tools available to our users so they can start embedding privacy as they now embed security into every single product.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that. I'm an extrovert and I love talking to people, which may be somewhat rare for folks in my profession. But I tend to think of privacy as an interesting topic. One of the big distinguishers between privacy and security is that there is an element of human judgment in privacy that has been more successfully automated in security. It's a little bit clearer when you have bad actors in your system versus when you're working on a privacy program. There may be some slightly blurry lines where you have to make some informed judgment calls to say, are we making appropriate use of the data we have and being responsible stewards of it? And really what you're aiming for with a privacy program, especially when you're just getting started, is you're aiming to have the human to human conversations. You're aiming to educate, you're aiming to collaborate, and the tools and technologies you put in place are focused on getting you to that point, setting the right tripwires so that people will know, oh, this is a good time to engage the privacy office. We don't understand this, or we're doing something that we have been told is probably a red flag. So let's go ahead and start having a discussion. I think those things are really critical, and that's why a good checklist can educate as well as control a process. Your developers can look at a checklist and say, you know what, I don't totally understand the terms here, or I'm not totally sure what's being asked here. This is an opportunity to educate myself as to why these particular issues matter.
If I could ask, Alfonso, as you work with clients, how do you think about prioritizing the education of the client writ large in their privacy by design journey?
So I think it's kind of similar to my previous answer. I think you need to have materials available to the different levels. You know, it's not going to be the same impact what the board is looking for in privacy from what a senior developer or developer is just looking out of a product, right? And I think the main success of all these programs is sort of like working as a unit and having that sponsorship from the board on like saying, well, as a company, we're going to produce a product that is privacy compliant, or that is focused in privacy, that supports the privacy concept as an entity. And it doesn't matter, it's not a technology company, or it's not I don't know, like a financial system or financial product. You know, at the end of the day, every single company and every single industry, I think right now should be looking at what privacy brings to value to their core product and core offering, and use that also as a differentiator, right? We've been seeing a lot of companies that are using that to sort of like set up from the back and be like, you were doing technology, or we're doing this specific product, but we're also giving an additional layer of security or privacy to that product that could help us differentiate from the market. And in terms of training, I mean, I think the tools at different levels could be useful, and having those available for them. And I think most importantly, having a clear way of communication and understanding when you need to raise that out to the privacy office, or when you need to consult with a privacy office. I think that's what I've been seeing that is successful with a lot of my clients.
The three of you have brought up lots of topics all related to the people challenges of privacy, because I think similar to security, where I think early on, a lot of the problems were people related problems. Like, how do you get people to use right passwords, and before the tools kind of caught up to the people problems. I guess when you think about privacy and implementing privacy programs within companies and within teams, how do you make sure that these IT teams stay motivated on something that on a topic that they might consider as like a checkbox compliance exercise? I don't remember whose turn it is, so let's start with Alfonso.
Wow, a lot of questions for me.
Sorry.
So, well, I think, I mean, at the end of the day, again, I think it should come from the board. Like the value should be converted into value to the company. It's not just like that you need to comply with all these new requirements and checklist items just because you have to do that, or because we have a regulator coming after us. I think it should be at some point translated into value to the company, into aligning into the the values of the company itself. And again, I think that's a sensitive topic, because not all the companies are looking or focused in their mission or their vision statements to talk about privacy. But I think as we're moving forward, we're going to start seeing that privacy and security become like a trend in every industry. So if we get that sponsorship from the board and from the upper management, there's going to be a natural alignment from what people do. And at the end of the day, one way that you can see, and some companies are using to start motivating, let's say motivating or motivating that compliance stuff, is by just attaching that to performance metrics, right? At the end of the day, if we have developers creating software, let's just start measuring like how many of those software packets or software packages are coming out with privacy defects, and start using some good metrics and key metrics that can translate into value for the business, because they can start speaking about like 98% of our products come out with any defect on privacy or security related flows, but also that could translate into positive things for the developers, right? They can start thinking like, well, 99% of 98% of the things that I'm creating are coming out without any defect. So I think it's sort of like has to be like a two-way kind of thing, like the value for the company and then the value for the employee.
Yeah, I like the idea of privacy defects. Like, I never really thought of them that way, but it's such a great way to think about it. I'm gonna take that one. Ed, you're nodding vigorously. Do you want to?
Yeah, I love the concept of privacy defects, and I think it's an interesting question of how do you motivate people. I look at it. I have a deep background in software development, so I think about kind of my concept of the average software developer or the average software development team, and how much time they really want to spend on those. I think, Susan, you put it exactly right. The sort of exaggerated view is this is a check the box activity. How much time do we spend on kind of paperwork? And I think there are generally two ways that you motivate people. You either make it really painful to do the wrong thing, or you make it really easy to do the right thing. And I think a lot of privacy programs, when they first get started, and this is the downside of checklists, is they make it really painful to do the right thing. They put a lot of paper on your desk that are checklists that you have to fill out, and new meetings you have to attend, and things like that you get to feel like, wait, this is all just a big burden. And I think there are a couple of different ways to sort of reduce that. One of them is to look at the tooling you use and how do you use it. And I think there are definitely privacy tools coming on the market that are oriented at making it easier to collaborate on privacy and making it less painful than emailing an Excel spreadsheet around and then yelling at people to fill it out. So making doing the right thing easier in that way, I think is a good one. Another one is, again, I'll come back to the educational thing. I'm a nerd. It's in my bones, and I love to learn new things. And for me, getting introduced to security as a developer and the idea of security training, and that, hey, as a professional developer, I am leveling up the more I learn about topics like security and development. And so if I have access to training on secure coding practices and things like that, it's an opportunity for me to learn and to grow my skill set. Likewise with privacy, I don't think probably enough organizations may realize how much there is to know about privacy, and the idea of sort of democratizing that information and trying to get the rest of the organization kind of thinking about it and thinking about it as a way to level themselves up in their own profession, I think that can be a really good tool for motivating a team to really care about privacy.
I think that's really insightful. One of our attendees made a comment that 10 years ago, we were not even worried about privacy. And so I think this idea that that it's an opportunity for folks in technology to up-level their skill set and really be more on the cutting edge of caring about that. I think it's a really insightful, interesting way to think about it. Chris, I know you are big at keeping teams motivated and moving forward. I've seen that in action. I guess, what's your take? What's your take on this?
I guess one of them is I would stretch it into the product discipline, right? We do a ton of work in product teams and in that function of user experience and doing emotional surveys of whether users like a particular UI or a color or a button. I think privacy should be in that discipline as you're developing it. Essentially put that as part of your design criteria for your product. How are customers going to feel about our use of their data going forward? I think it's something that hasn't been pushed that far upstream or pulled that far upstream, whichever direction that is. And then the other one is always in my mind, it's always emphasizing the kind of the revenue side of the equation as opposed to the cost side, for lack of a better paradigm, right? This isn't about compliance. This is about like, how is this letting us do things better and faster? If from the outset we really understand how under what consent we're getting the data, and the user has really good understanding of how we're going to use their data, then we can feel really free to go very fast in that direction, and we don't have to second guess ourselves. So I look at it that way, as kind of those two dimensions of trying to get it in the conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up revenue, and this is another area where I think like there's overlap with what we've seen in security. Like on the security side, what I saw in my time prior to Wirewheel was, and Alfonso, I'm curious if you see this as well, is that it wasn't until companies started seeing the financial impact of breaches and it being in the news and everything else that behavior started to change at the deeper level. I guess I'll throw this out. I'm curious. Do you think that's a fair assessment for privacy, Chris?
I mean, I definitely think it is. You see companies like Apple, which are basically anchoring very hard on their position is on privacy, and I think it's not an immediate switch, but it's definitely one of those things where you're going to see people auguring towards. If I have the choice between two brands, that's going to be one of the factors that they go into it, right? It's very easy for people to match on price, but when you start seeing, when I'm going with an ecosystem A, where there's kind of a repeated instances of things that make me uncomfortable from a privacy standpoint versus ecosystem B, I'm going to go with B, right? And so I think that's definitely one that's good. It's harder to quantify, but I think people know it when they see it. And so I think it's definitely going to be a trend.
That's interesting. Ed or Alfonso, do either of you have any thoughts on that particular?
Just to emphasize what Chris just mentioned, I think the value of privacy could be seen as a differentiator. It doesn't matter the industry or the product. So it's just becoming something tangible, I guess, that it will help companies separate from the back and start like saying, well, you know what, we're translating this back into users and clients and final customers. What does that mean for them into privacy? What does that mean for them, right? Like it's not just talking about like we have a bunch of DLP tools and we have a bunch of like firewalls and segregation and everything in the back working. That's just completely fine. That's our IT job there. But how that translates into customer perspective and into customer terms, right? Like for them means that their social security number is not going to be out. For them means that they can making sure that or can feel secure to use their phones to pay on a supermarket. I mean, we just need to see that from or putting those shoes to understand what's the value that we're adding with privacy products to our clients.
I'd also add, it's almost like we artificially are stuck in this privacy versus security, because I think from a consumer standpoint, I don't honestly care if my data got out because of a bad actor making some kind of breach, or you just sent it because you thought it was in your rights, but I disagree with you. I as a consumer am upset that my data is someplace where I didn't want it to go to. So I think it's almost it's an interesting thing that we draw that line, but really, I don't know if people actually feel that line.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point.
One of the things I'd throw in there, it's interesting thinking about this notion of how the perception of privacy as revenue impacting can motivate companies. You asked a question earlier, Susan, sort of top down, how do we motivate people to within the company to participate in privacy activities?
The big privacy stick.
Yeah, I think there's a question from the bottom up of how do we motivate management to think of privacy as a first class concern, and how do we as folks who care about privacy, how do we motivate those discussions? And I think it's like any other prioritization discussion in a business. I think it does at the end of the day come down to matters of dollars and cents and perceived risk and that sort of stuff. And there are definitely tools there. Security professionals for a long time, they operate in a risk-based field. And so there's an element of it which is about attempting to at least provide some level of quantitative assessment of the risk. What's the risk of a breach? What's the impact of a breach? That sort of stuff. And collecting data points about enforcement actions is certainly helpful because it helps shine a light on the potential impact of a privacy issue. You can also take a look at the cost of privacy issues, and that can be a useful decision maker. Two things to think about are, number one, if we are as an organization committed to a particular stance on privacy, say we've agreed that we need to be CCPA compliant, and we have some kind of statement either from our own internal counsel or external counsel about what that really means for us. Looking at the cost of the compliance program can be helpful because it motivates you saying, okay, well, it's costing us X amount of money a year to do these certification exercises. We should invest in trying to reduce those costs. And that means investing in better tools and better methodology for privacy programs. Another good data point is potentially missed opportunity. And this goes back to something Chris said, where we're not able to make use of the data that we are sitting on to take advantage of this new business opportunity because of the opaque nature of the consent that we've got. And we can't currently use the data we're sitting on for a new purpose because we're not allowed to do it because we haven't done the right privacy due diligence. And that is also another example of how a privacy concern could be made concrete, tangible, and put on the table alongside other sort of financially driven prioritization discussions.
Those are good points. Thank you, Ed.
I was going to say, especially in machine learning, Ed, where you're living now, I imagine it's not hard for one bad data set to poison a whole pool of information for you.
No, it absolutely is, and it's ML is a topic in and of itself, because there you're talking about both the if you know that you have predictive power in your data and you can put a dollar value on that, then you can really motivate some good discussions about how to put ML projects into the field. But if you're still in an exploratory phase and you haven't proven yet, but you believe there might be predictive power in your data, then you're on a different footing to say, okay, we're justified in the expense of getting the consent and doing the right activity around this. So yeah, ML's a fun space, and the intersection of ML and privacy is, it's huge.
I think there are a couple of, you guys have brought up a couple of really challenging aspects of privacy. Machine learning, I think Alfonso mentioned third-party vendor verification, which is huge. And then target marketing, consent management. As you kind of think about tackling these complex privacy concerns and privacy issues, where do you see IT teams getting most stuck in some of these challenges? They're hard problems to solve. Where are the sticking points? Where are the pitfalls? What advice would you give to people to avoid that? And do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. So I'm super curious to hear Alfonso's perspective on this too, from a perspective of breadth, having worked with different clients. But I know when I think about how do you get started, you're looking at an array of different issues, and how do you sort of get started? I think about what are the, that sort of sweet spot of the things that have the most impact and are potentially the easiest to fix. And one of the things that I think is is true of a lot of privacy and a lot of privacy breaches, is that they come from what you may think of as sort of dark matter. There may be situations where you're still sending data to a vendor you used 5 years ago and nobody really remembers why, but it's still there and it's still going on. Or you had commissioned some infrastructure and were doing a project for a particular purpose, and there's a bunch of data left over there and it never got torn down after the project or something like that. There's a visibility component that can be really transformational once you start to get into it, because it really helps you understand not just your privacy exposure, but also other issues. You may find, that it is not uncommon for large companies to do audits of, like, for instance, if you're in the cloud, check and see how many S3 buckets you have versus how many you use. It's absolutely not uncommon for companies to find that they have massive amounts of data stored that is unnecessary and replicated and that sort of stuff. So when I think about tackling some of those issues, I think about starting from a position of visibility, and I think it comes down to sort of inventory. And I will say that I think in the privacy space that third-party interactions tend to be ones that can be the most tricky. So folks who may be doing direct business directly with you, they may not realize who else their data is then going to, and that may be a source of trouble. And likewise, when data leaves your system, you may not know exactly what the vendor is doing with it. And so drilling into those, I think, can tend to be where some of that low-hanging fruit is.
And you read my mind that I think that's probably the more challenging stage right now, like doing a comprehensive data mapping. I know that concept has been floating around for quite a long time, and we always have like two perspectives. We try to do that from a business perspective, which is easy because we know what's the purpose of processing the data, we know what's the legal basis around it. But when we try to match that back to what that means into our IT environment and our like cloud environment and cloud and vendors environment, that's where it gets start messy, right? Like for a regular business user, they're just going to see a cloud application that it sits down there that holds the PII, and that's it, right? But when you start unfolding and sitting down with the IT group, they will say like, well, you know what? In order to have that application working, I have like 10 different other systems replicating data and moving personal data all over the place to make that final screen show what the clients or what the customer end user needs to understand.
You also have the exact reverse problem, right? Where you talk to the IT team and they say, and you tell them, you have a database that looks like it has social security numbers in it. Why do you have that database? And they say, I don't know. It's part of this larger ecosystem of applications. I have no idea what the business people are doing with it. They're doing something, but it's opaque to me. I just run the database. So you have, the lack of information in both directions.
Yeah, and the way we have seen some of those challenges sort of like being solved, or I mean, there's no magic formula to solve some of those things, but I guess the easiest way is just to have both teams in the same table and discussing that as a product, discussing that as a purpose, kind of like building this around a purpose of processing activity rather than just around a system or around a specific business process. So I think it's just a matter of like kind of like mixing both things and creating a combined approach in order to make more successful parts there.
Well, one thing that is really powerful, and it's a trend that I think is, this is an area where I think just in early days, people were nervous about cloud adoption because they felt like security wasn't going to be where they needed it to be. And I think gradually it's come around to where people realize that cloud providers can generally probably help them do a better job of security than they might be able to do on their own, managing their own infrastructure. Likewise, I think cloud tooling has a lot of promise for privacy. And one of the things that people frequently do with cloud tooling is they tag things for resource allocation purposes. And it starts life as a cost exercise, right? You attach costs to line of businesses and projects based on the infrastructure that's tagged with those projects. But that also helps you from a privacy perspective, because you see infrastructure that's tagged for particular business use cases, and you can be more confident about what it's for. And that can form the basis of a really powerful sort of periodic audit mechanism. Whereas if you find resources that are untagged, or resources whose tags are out of date and haven't been certified, then you've got an opportunity to spot potential issues. So I think what we're going to see as we all move forward into the future with all these issues is getting better with infrastructure in general is going to make you better with security, is going to make you better with privacy, is going to make you faster, is going to make you more money. I think there's a bit of a potential for a virtuous cycle here.
Yeah, become more educated in both topics, right? Like security and privacy. So even from the procurement stage, you start assessing that your vendor or your cloud provider will have like better practices or better privacy practices in place. Like they're not just focused on availability or I don't know, in just making sure that your website is up like 99% of the time. I mean, you're going to start like worried about other SLAs or service levels agreement that are going to be more around what does that translate back to like my final user, right? So for example, like how many attacks can you stop? How many incidents can you report me back? Or what's the average response time from your security operations teams to tell me if there's an infiltration of or exfiltration of personal data within any of my systems that we have stored on your cloud? So I think like practices are going to mature. And service providers are going to start also offering those services as part of their current offering and trying to make that more privacy and security related and effective, but in terms again on what that means for the client or the final customer.
Chris, you've been quiet. What's your take on what the challenges and pitfalls are?
No, I think one of the things also is that it's in working with different companies on privacy is that is focusing on what you do, right? They often want to go to like where their worst problem is from a privacy standpoint, like, oh wow, our HR system has a lot of private information in it, so let's focus on there. But it's like, but you're a pizza shop, right? That's not really your number one thing that you do. Like, focus is getting people to part of the prioritization and kind of focus area is trying to start people on what is the core part of your business? How does data relate to that core value proposition? And get started there, right? That's your first. I mean, Ed, you're 100% right. There is the flotsam and jetsam of like, we have a S3 bucket over here, and I don't actually know what's in it. You know, unless somebody says otherwise, let's delete it tomorrow. There's that challenge. But I think the other just making sure that, you know, especially as people use third-party vendors, right? So more and more companies are focusing on essentially what is their value proposition, what's their real area of expertise, and outsourcing as much as they can. Well, one, it allows you to really focus in on the privacy aspects of your core business process. But then two, it really puts dependency on when you're making those third-party decisions. Are they in alignment with me in how we're going to handle data? Are they going to be responsive to me when I have to explore a privacy data request for one of my customers and pass on that information to them?
You mentioned like teens just starting out. I think that's an interesting perspective of like, you don't necessarily go where you think the biggest hole is, go where you're going to have the biggest value to what you're doing. I think that's an interesting way to think about it.
It is, just because I know from people that are new to privacy, they equate privacy with PII. That's the first thing that's kind of a big issue,
yes.
Right? So they're like, I can search for phone numbers. I'm like, well, that really doesn't help. And so it becomes, I think one of the pitfalls, or I guess blind alleys that oftentimes IT teams do, is they get challenged with something on privacy. They equate privacy with PII, and they immediately get into, I'm going to search the enterprise for PII, when really that may or may not address any of the issues they potentially have. And that's why I always think, start with what is your core business, and then when you understand what your core business is and how relevant to there, then you can start making prioritization decisions as you go downstream.
I think that I just nodded vigorously when Chris mentioned equating privacy with PII. I think from my personal experience, part of my journey started off with a very narrow perspective on where is the personally identifiable information in our product, in our infrastructure, in our applications. And then once you look at privacy and the fact that we're not really just considering PII, we're considering PI more generally. So these are things that are linked to customers. Then as a developer, as a software architect, I am terrified, because now you're talking about something that, instead of being sort of individual fields or tokenizable elements in a larger application. Now you're talking about almost all the data I'm dealing with. A lot of the data I'm dealing with linked or linkable to these individuals. And now I'm terrified, and I'm going to fight every step of the way to say, okay, no, I don't have any, or I'm going to do whatever I can to avoid touching it. And I think the key observation, at least my key observation as I've learned more and as I've been more active in the privacy space, is twofold. One is that privacy really is concerned with the broader set of information. It's not just PII, and if you limit yourself to that, you're going to start off with your aperture too narrow. But likewise, privacy isn't about get rid of it. It's not about you can't have any of that data. Privacy is about, are we making ethical use of the data that we have in correlation with the user's consent? And so one of the things that I think can be really powerful for a development team is the first time they experience a privacy review that goes well, when they're told that, oh, you have a database full of personal information. Let's talk about that. And the end result is not, oh my gosh, we've got to delete this or encrypt it, or you've got to upend the world. The answer is, sounds right, sounds good. Yep, we're using that for what it's intended for. And Chris's example of the HR system is a good one. Your HR system's almost certainly got personal information in it about all your employees. That's what they're for.
I hope it does.
Yeah, that's what they're for. You hope it does, exactly. And if you start off with alarm bells around every place that you have PII, you'll immediately create that kind of sort of oppositional internal culture. Whereas if you start off with the, what are we doing? What do we really need to do here? That can be a more gentle introduction and a way to sort of get people into that mindset.
So I think we have time for one more question. And I'm going to start with Chris. We'll go Chris, Alfonso, Ed for this last one, just so I remember. So what, and this is kind of goes to the topic of the, kind of to wrap up the topic of what we've all been talking about. What are the top 3 things that IT should be thinking about?
So even though that's the topic of this, I don't think I actually put it down into 3. So I'll just say
I am not surprised.
I'll put it down into just my one started, right? That's the top thing they can do, because this is not a problem that's going to get better with time, and it's not going away. So the main thing is that if you look at between the evolution of laws in California for a US kind of omnibus legislation around privacy, other countries, you just need to get started. So I think that the first thing is that delaying it is a mistake, even if it's just an exercise of organizational education, or even if it's just an exercise of starting the process of planning for next fiscal year. You just get started is my number one thing I would just say. I don't really have a 2 or 3.
Well, that's good advice. Alfonso?
I would say that probably, again, one of the reasons why this should be a priority is because at some point, it doesn't matter that your IT, you have a final customer, a final client that will see some value in the privacy practices, right? So you just have to figure out what that value means for them. And it could be an internal client. It could be somebody within your organization. It doesn't have to be like the final customer that goes and swipe their credit card into the terminal or into the vending machine. At the end of the day, you're trying to protect or secure what your client needs. And if that's someone internal, just make sure to understand what privacy will bring value to them. And I think that's where it will start helping, or sort of like these IT teams to understand what's the priority they need to do for privacy.
Great, thanks. And Ed.
I'll bring us home. So my thought is this, that probably the number one thing an IT organization could be thinking about is, if I'll sum it up in a word and say inventory, and I'll explain it this way. I'll say, as an IT team, you own the resources that are powering the business, and you're likely the stewards of a lot of the data resources that are going to be the focus of privacy. And the extent to which you're aware of what they are and where they are, and can link them back to the business purpose, that's not just going to make you better at privacy. It's going to make you better at security. It's going to make you better at cost controls. It's going to make you better at a wide variety of things. And so from the perspective of an IT organization, I would think that getting beginning to develop the mechanisms to understand what you have and what you're using it for, I think it's a very high leverage activity that I don't think most organizations would necessarily rebel against. I think it's a great place to get started, and it really has a lot of potential to improve privacy for you and your customers.
This is great advice. I hope it was helpful for our attendees, but I was taking notes, and there's pieces. I've been doing this for a while, and there's still pieces I'm like, oh, I'm going to take that and see if I can implement that as well. So thank you, Ed, Alfonso, and Chris for joining us today. Thanks to our attendees. I'm going to hand it back to Judy.
Hi, thanks everyone. And thank you so much. I learned a lot too. It's a great webinar. I just want to close and let everyone know, first of all, that today we launched for Data Privacy Day, a free CCPA training course for compliance with CCPA. You can sign up now on our website. And just to let everyone know, we have one last webinar in our series. We have two clients of WireWheels, StockX and Shoes.com, are going to come talk about their implementation and just talk about why they decided to buy versus build, and then things to keep in mind as you look at implementing privacy technology. Thank you everyone for attending,